Hello, I'm Michael Liebreich and this is Cleaning Up. Sovereign wealth funds are among the largest asset owners in the world, and as such, they have an outsized influence on whether investment flows to polluting industries or to climate solutions. And no sovereign wealth fund is bigger than the one belonging to Norway. My guest this week on Cleaning Up is Carine Smith, Chief Governance and Compliance Officer at Norges Bank Investment Group, which manages Norway's $1.4 trillion government pension fund global. Please welcome Carine Smith to Cleaning Up.
Before we start, if you're enjoying Cleaning Up, please make sure that you like, subscribe, and leave a review. That really helps other people to find us. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to us on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform, and follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Instagram to participate in the discussion. Also, you can visit cleaningup.live to access over 160 hours of conversations with extraordinary climate leaders, and you can subscribe to our free newsletter. That's cleaningup.live. Cleaning Up is brought to you by our lead supporter, Capricorn Investment Group, the Liebreich Foundation, and the Gilardini Foundation.
So, Carine, thank you for joining us here on Cleaning Up today.
Very nice to be here, Michael.
Could we start by you describing your role, the short version, because I've done a little introduction, but it's great to hear it from your own mouth, in your own words.
Okay, so I'm what is called Chief Governance and Compliance Officer of Norges Bank Investment Management, which is the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And among some of the things I look after is how the fund work with responsible investment. And of course, climate is a big part of that.
Very good. So we're going to get into some of the kind of metrics and, you know, the role of Norges Bank Investment Management and the big pension fund that the sovereign fund that you run. But I think we just got to give a little bit of context also for the audience, because you and I actually, we met through your husband who was at McKinsey. So I was at McKinsey with Philip. So that's how we met. But then we actually spent a lot of time skiing. We had this big group that would do the Engadin ski marathon. So I'm going to give you a bit of a hard time, obviously, as I always do on these episodes. But I think people need to know the context is we kind of know each other quite well and go quite far back, right?
Yes, Michael, and what was quite interesting, it took a guy from the UK to, learn or teach me about the Engadin ski marathon. I actually haven't heard about it. And as a Norwegian, it was quite interesting to join with a group of English people and ski with them. And I think we did that Engadin ski marathon for probably 6 years or so.
That's
and
right.
Actually, before I started getting ski marathon, I'd never done the skating before. So you were the one that got me into that technique.
So, yeah, that's right. So I took this big group and we raised money for various charities, and I actually did it for 7 or 8 years. We raised quite a lot of money, I mean, many hundreds of thousands of pounds. But my main claim to fame was to introduce a Norwegian contingent to skating, cross-country skating, which is, of course, kind of like heresy in Norway, I understand. But I'm very proud of that.
Yeah, and we were very thankful because it was really fun. So we were a group of Norwegian women, actually, who did it for the first time when we went with you. And we did it for, I think, quite a few years after. And we recently talked about maybe we should try to do it again.
Yeah, I hate to think how slow I would be. What was interesting was that we were doing that, skiing and doing those marathons, but that was really before I had started New Energy Finance and before you had become responsible for, among other things, the climate strategy or climate governance at a incredibly major financial institution, right?
Yeah, so it's very nice to now connect again after all these years, Michael.
Indeed. Now let's get on to those metrics for how significant is Norges Bank and what are you, because, everybody hears rumors about this tremendous Norwegian sort of sovereign wealth and what happens to it. So give us some metrics.
Okay, yes, it's true. We are quite a large fund. So we are around almost 15,000 billion Norwegian kroner. So if we take it into dollars, we are around $1.5 trillion fund. So quite big, and 70% of the fund is invested in listed equities. So that means it's such a large part of the fund is invested in companies on various stock exchanges around the world. That means we're probably the largest single owner of listed companies. So we own around 1.5% of every listed company in the world. So a small part in around 9,000 companies in more than 70 countries. In addition, we have around 27-28% in bonds, as a few percentages in real estate. Actually, we have quite a few buildings in London, and then a small part in unlisted renewable infrastructure.
Okay, so broadly speaking, you own about 1.5% of all quoted companies in. And now, what index? What do you track? Because that's not across the world. It's quite focused, or it's quite concentrated in the developed world because of the index that you track. Correct?
That's correct. So we say we're not an index fund, but an index near fund. That means we start with following an index, and it's the FTSE Global All Cap Index. And then we have a sort of margin of where we can go outside that index. We have a tracking error of 125 basis points. So that means we have some investment managers that are just focusing on following the index, but then we have a large active investment arm that also take positions in companies. We call it taking overweight or underweight compared to the index. So we have sort of 50, 60 portfolio managers that take active investment decisions every day. So not just following the index, but also being index near.
And this is all really important context as we get onto some of the kind of the governance and the climate investment strategy and so on, because the message here is that you are so big that you can't really depart very much from owning a bit of everything. And so therefore, what the task that you have is to track this FTSE all cap index, but to within plus or minus 125 basis points. So it's not an index, it's not a pure index, but it's almost by definition going to be nearly an index, correct? Have I paraphrased correctly?
You have, that's absolutely correct. But that means because we're so large, the tracking we do, or the investment decision we do outside of just pure index tracking are quite large. So, we have investment managers that sits with mandates for, it can be billion of dollars.
Yes, and as they say, a billion here, a billion there, and pretty soon you're talking real money.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now,
and that's important when you think about how the fund operates, is that we're not just a passive fund. We are an index near fund with active management.
And let's come back to some of the allocations that you have made within that kind of parameter set. But let's establish some basics. Where does the money come from, and what is it used for?
Yeah. So the fund was set up to really transform the wealth that Norwegians have from the oil and gas resources in the North Sea, and transform those revenues into financial assets abroad. And the whole point was that when the fund was set up, that some very clever politicians thought that we should not just spend all the money from that's derived from our oil and gas resources by the generation that found it, but we should put it into financial assets and also save for future generation. So the whole point of the fund is really to be a generational fund that support the Norwegian welfare state, because we take the proceeds from the oil and gas production, put it into financial assets abroad, and spend a little bit of the fund every year, but just a little bit. So there is a rule that says we should only spend every year the sort of expected real return of the fund. So it's said that the expected return of the fund is 3%. So the politician can take up to 3% of the fund every year to top up the state budget.
And the fund is so big that ends up being about 20% of the state budget, correct? That 3%, just that real return, is paying for sort of 20% of everything.
That's right. So if you think about it in Norway, every fifth teacher, every fifth nurse, every fifth doctor is really paid for by the proceeds from the fund. And in that way, you can really truly say that the fund support the Norwegian welfare state, and has done it for many years. And the point is that we'll continue to do it for also many, many further years.
And I understand that one of the key drivers, one of the people who set this up, was Jens Stoltenberg, who's now head of NATO and very involved, obviously, in the response to Russia's aggression on Ukraine. But there's a fantastic, for those who are interested in how to set up a sovereign wealth fund, there's a fantastic set of speeches that he gave, which talk about one of the reasons was it's sort of simple to think of it as saving for the future, but it was also very important not to splurge this oil income and just drive an enormous wave of inflation in what's really quite a small economy. And if all this money came in because of oil and gas and people started spending it immediately, you'd have had just huge inflation and no savings.
That's correct. And if Jens Stoltenberg, he's by education an economist, and he had thought deeply about it, because he was in the government when really the proceeds from the oil and gas came into the country. And I think it was two ways of looking at it, as you say. Also, first of all, to save it for future generation, but also to protect the Norwegian mainland economy. Because I think there's lots of examples out there of economies that are not fared well, and you get a huge inflow from natural resources in very short space into the economy. I think it's a well-known term called the Dutch disease, for instance.
Right, and you are not allowed to invest domestically. So your mandate is not to invest domestically. So everything is overseas. So if you're going to drive that splurge, it cannot be within Norway for those reasons, correct?
Exactly. So the whole point is to de-risk it also and protect the Norwegian economy. So that's why we invest in the rest of the world, but not in Norway at all.
Now, can you talk to us about how is that mandate created? Right. So who do you report to? Who gives you? Who sets those rules?
Yeah. So the one important element of the fund is that it's a truly democratic governance structure around it. So the main decisions when it comes to the fund is decided by the parliament, decided by the people. This is a fund in the end owned by the people of Norway, the 5 million plus Norwegians. So big decisions are anchored in the parliament. Then we get the more detailed mandate we get from the Ministry of Finance. So they give us quite a detailed mandate, including allocations decisions. The big allocation decisions comes from the parliament down to the ministry, then down to us. And that's how the reporting lines go back. We report up to the ministry and they report up then to the parliament. So every year there's a white paper that discusses, the results of the fund, how the fund has been managed, and that based on that white paper, then there's decisions in the finance committee, in the parliament, and then changes may or may not happen. So it's a good parliamentary discussion every year about the big decisions regarding the fund.
Okay, and so we're sort of homing in now on that allocation question, because there's already one oddity in a sense, which is that you've got 70% in public equities, then you've got a big chunk in public debt. You've got some real estate and you've got some renewable infrastructure, but very small. But you don't have the huge swathe of companies that are privately held. You are not so if you look at a lot of, let's say, university endowments, and then also pension funds, insurance companies with very long-term horizons that can afford illiquid investments, they would have quite a big allocation to alternatives, including private equity, but you have none.
That's correct. And many of the sovereign wealth fund like us also have allocation to private equity, private companies. And there has been discussions previously of whether or not we should open up a new asset class for private equity. And indeed, this will probably be discussed also in the future. And one of our roles as a fund is that we advise the ministry on the various strategies around the fund management. And the ministry has recently written to us and asked some questions around private equity or private companies, whether we should invest in that. So that's sort of the start of a discussion. What the outcome will be, it's unclear. In the end, it will be up to the politicians to decide whether or not they will open up for that asset class.
Right, but that process has also got its critics, right? Because you've got all the investment knowledge, the investment managers all sit within Norges Bank, and then you advise the Ministry of Finance and you tell them all about how to invest. So, but they don't, do they really have the capability to say, actually, your advice is poor, your allocation should be different, the way you take into account megatrends, whatever they are, and we'll get on to climate, should be completely different, and here's how to do it. Do they have the skills? Because they're giving you a mandate, but aren't you really kind of writing your own homework questions?
I'll tell you, Michael, there are extremely smart people sitting in the Ministry of Finance. So they have absolutely the capability to scrutinize in detail every advice they get from us. And they also have access to experts, so absolutely, they can really make their own decisions based upon the input from us. And of course, it's many considerations here. It's considerations around what gives the most return over the longer term, but there are also issues around transparency, about costs, and about risk. So there are many issues to take into considerations, and they absolutely have very smart people that are able to take the right decision on this.
Okay, and let's come on to then the question of climate, right? Because there's been a number of iterations. That mandate gets updated from time to time. And there was big discussions, which I remember very well, around 2013, 2014 about divestment. And then there's been some more updates, I think, around 2021, and that refine the response, particularly around coal and oil. And then there's a lot of activity around climate that's kind of going to and fro between yourself and the ministry at the moment. So talk us through from, that 2014 intense discussion about divestment.
Yeah, so there was quite a few years ago, as you say, there was a discussion of whether or not we should be invested in oil and gas companies. And the driver really for that discussion was more from a sort of financial risk perspective, whether it made sense or not that if we were to de-risk all the revenues, all the money coming from the North Sea, from oil and gas production, if that were to be de-risked in financial assets abroad, did it really make sense to put those money into the oil and gas companies? And what was decided in the end was that we should continue to be invested in the more, let's say, integrated oil and gas companies that has processes both upstream, midstream, downstream, but that we should sell out of the companies that are purely exploration and upstream production companies to sort of exclude that. But that was from, as I said, more a financial risk perspective. Then there was a big discussion around coal, and we have something called ethical exclusions, where where the parliament has decided that there are just certain products we should not make money from. Companies that make money from certain products, we should not invest in those. But that's more from an ethical perspective rather than from a financial risk perspective. And so it's decided we not to be invested in tobacco and also coal. So we now excluded companies either basing their production on coal or being involved in coal production, coal mining. Other products, we also certain weapons and cannabis for recreational purposes.
Okay, but so on coal, you've divested. I mean, and I think it's any company that's more than 30% of its business. So it's pretty much, but coal is very small in terms of market cap. Of course, it's enormously damaging to the environment. So it's kind of the easy one. You don't have a big financial penalty for exiting, and it makes a huge impact on the climate. But the oil and gas one is very interesting. So, you know, you've divested from upstream specialist companies. But can you give examples of the names of such companies?
Yes, so the companies we have divested from, there are a certain sort of subcategory of the FTSE index. I'm
being a bit unfair, right? I'm asking you for the names of companies. And the reason I did that is because these are basically small companies. The companies, the big oil companies, Chevron, Exxon, Shell, BP, you know, and then Eni and Total and et cetera, they are not upstream only. The upstream only, they're the wildcatters, they're small companies. They're kind of easy to divest from. Financially, they don't really cause much pain.
Yeah, you caught me out there, Michael. I should have known the name of at least some of the companies. But you're right, we are still invested in the large oil and gas companies. And that's very much in line with the thinking around us being a broad-based investor, really being invested in the whole economy, except certain products, as I mentioned, for sort of we have excluded for ethical reasons, and some for more de-risking for financial reasons. So we absolutely still invested in the large oil and gas companies that most people have heard about.
Okay, now the context within the financial sector is also, there's been these sort of an increasing intensity of discussion from when I first got involved in it, which would have been 12, 15 years ago, but an intensity of discussion about the role of finance in either financing climate change or not financing climate change and steering the world away from climate change. And you know, when I say it was a sort of crescendo, probably the high point would have been perhaps the Glasgow COP26 in Glasgow 2021, with this thing called GFANZ, the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and all of its little baby acronym offspring, or in fact perhaps progenitors, TCFD, Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, etc., etc. I mean, I counted 60 of these organizations, all of which are sort of trying to encourage compliance with Paris, which is below 2 degrees of warming, well below 2 degrees, and aiming for 1.5 degrees. What has been Norges Bank's response to all of that? What has been your involvement in all of that?
Yeah, it's true. It's been a huge discussion in Norway too, and in particular in relation to the fund. What is our role in all of this? How should we work with climate change? And the government set down an expert group not too long ago to really look at, you know, how should we best position ourselves? Huge fund invested in as having a small part in the whole world economy. How best to work with climate change? And the conclusion of the expert group, and also which again then resulted in a change in our mandate, and it also in the end resulted in us coming out with a climate action plan. But in gist, the sort of result there was that it's really in the fund's long-term interest as a financial investor that there is in the world an orderly transition in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. It's better for the world economy. It's better for us owning a small part of the world economy that there is an orderly transition. That means for us as a global fund, we really, what should I say? Where we want to go is for the companies we have invested in to really follow the goals of the Paris Agreement and set net zero targets 2050. That's really, and as a large fund, our role in this is really to push the companies to get to net zero 2050, push support, being an active investor. And that was the sort of background for our climate action plan, is really to explain how we, as a large investor in all these 9,000 companies, how we can work to support and push for the companies to reach net zero.
But let me contrast that, though, with the investment strategy, right? Because the investment strategy that we've laid out, that you've described, that we've discussed, is you own kind of a bit of everything with a few exclusions. And the few exclusions, the reason I kind of pushed you on it, it's coal and it's a bit of upstream oil and gas, but fundamentally you own, and you said it yourself, the near index. So in a world that is, the policy at the moment is sort of headed towards 2.5 degrees, but corporates have not yet reflected that. So their actions are probably on track for, let's say, 3 degrees. And that's what you own. You own a bunch of companies that are probably aiming for 3 degrees of warming. And, that's not exactly leadership, is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's many ways you can think about this as a global, large, long-term investor. You can take the choice and say, we don't want to be invested in some of these large emitting companies. We're saying to just sell out is not going to reduce emissions. It's not going to change the world. What we're saying is that we want to be an owner in the large emitter and try to use our leverage as an investor to reduce the emissions of these companies, and being a support and a challenge in the transition the companies need to go through. And also for us, we said we don't have an absolute goal for our own portfolio. And that's because we say, we own a small part of the whole world, and we can't say that we want to be a 1.5 degree fund in a 2 or 2.5 degree world. Rather, we want to be an owner in the economy and push for a change. But other funds may think differently. I think we don't want to be an owner in the large emitter and just allocate the fund to the green companies. But for us, that doesn't really make sense. It's not going to change the world.
Okay, what you said is a very interesting phrase, very, very pithy phrase. You said you can't be at the size you are as investors. You can't be a 1.5 degree fund in a 2 or 2.5 degree world. And I think that's, so does that mean that you're not members of GFAN's Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, the, Climate Pathways Initiative, all of these different sort of alphabet soup? Are you not members of any of them?
So we're not members in those you mentioned, and we're not members in organizations that have a clear net zero targets for the funds in the organization. But we are a member of many other investor collaboration. But again, we sort of don't think the climate will be solved by big allocation decisions. We think the climate will be solved by companies changing their investment and changing basically getting their emissions down.
Okay, so now this is the articulation of the strategy that says don't divest, but engage and use your influence to change the companies sort of from within or from within the shareholder base. Is that fair?
That's fair. Yep.
So now
we call it engage to change.
Engage to change. Okay. Now there was another organization that was very committed to engage to change, and that was the Church of England Pensions Board. And the Church of England Pensions Board articulated very clearly that they continued to own even oil and gas companies. I think they maybe like yourselves, maybe they maybe were not in coal anymore, but they were definitely in oil and gas. And then just recently, a few weeks ago, they actually, as we saw Shell and BP dialing back their commitments to a transition to clean energy, the Church of England's pension board announced that they would disinvest from Shell and other oil and gas companies, which they call failing to show sufficient ambition to decarbonize in line with the aims of the Paris Agreement. And the CEO, John Ball, said something very interesting. He said, there is a significant misalignment between the long-term interests of our pension fund and continued investment in companies seeking short-term profit maximization at the expense of the ambition needed to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And he specifically names BP and Shell. So is he wrong? Is it possible to engage? Are they responding to engagement?
Our view is different than the Church of England here. We want to continue to be an owner still in some of the companies they sold out to. What we're saying is that we may divest from companies where we absolutely think the business model is just not compatible where we want to go. And it may be at a point where we decide, okay, we are going to divest. And we have divested from many companies due to climate risk. For us, climate risk is financial risk. And there are many smaller companies we have divested from because we think their model is such that, it's too much risk in that model.
But meanwhile, your seventh biggest holding is Shell. And you own, you're amongst the biggest shareholders, amongst the top 5 shareholders of just, I don't want to say many, but numerous. So Shell, BP, and across the board with these large oil and gas companies, you're amongst the very biggest shareholders. So I guess the question would be, how do you know if your strategy is working? How do you measure? So you've got a strategy that says, we want to get to 1.5 degrees or certainly well below 2 degrees because that's better for the outcomes that's what our mandate requires. But how do you, but you've decided that you're going to engage. I can't remember, you said something for change, but how do you know if it's working? I mean, at what point do you say, actually, you know what, it's not working?
Yeah, it's right. We are invested in many of the large emitting companies in the world. If you look at our portfolio, what's interesting, 70% of our finance emissions are actually contributed by only 170 companies. So there are companies out there that really have most of the emissions. And those are the companies we really engage in depth. So when you say, of course, it's quite a way until 2050, but what we say to the company, you not only need to have net 2050 zero goals, you need to have short, medium, and long-term targets. In addition to that, you need to have a transition plan. You need to have a credible plan of how you're going to get to net zero. If you look at our portfolio, it's around 20% of the companies that have set credible net zero targets. And many of those don't even have a transition plan. So there is a long, long way to go until, all the companies in our portfolio, we probably will not get there, but, a majority will have credible targets, credible transition. But it's still some years to 2050. We will still push the companies For those companies that don't have targets, we will start by asking for targets. Companies that have targets, we will go into the transition plan. For those that transition plan, we will follow up the transition plan. So there are many steps here, at least we want to take before we consider selling out of the larger companies.
The problem is it sounds very sensible, but it's dramatically not working. I mean, meanwhile, your investments in this is your annual report. Your investments in energy companies ExxonMobil Corp, Shell PLC, and Chevron Corp made the biggest contributions to the return for the year. I mean, because you understand where I'm going, is that the criticism is you're taking oil money and you're putting it into oil companies, and then there's all this, oh, we'll engage for change, and et cetera, et cetera. But actually, you're not using the I mean, I suppose it's not only not using the soapbox or the power that you have, but also that it's very risky for what you're doing, because you are going to end up in a 2.5 or a 3 degree world, according to this current pathway, are you not?
So let us start by one. Absolutely right that there is a financial risk being invested in companies that does not adapt to a low carbon world. Absolutely. Also, it should say when we look at climate risk, we look at it sort of from a financial risk perspective. We're not a policy tool for the government. The government have other funds specifically related to sort of impact investment. So, but you're also right. Does it work? I've engaged to change approach. Clearly, it's not going in the right direction. I think just the weather we had this summer, I think if you haven't woken up earlier to sort of the physical risk of climate change, you certainly should have done it now, right? But then you have to think about what can we do as a financial investor invested in most of the world. We can concentrate the portfolio more, just on the lower emitter, or we can use the toolbox we have as an investor, which is influencing through dialogues. Last year we had 3,000 company meetings. Through voting, we have voted against many boards as a lack of tackling climate. But as small investor, minority investor in these 9,000 companies, we cannot dictate them. In the end, climate has to be, we can't solve the whole climate risk issue on our own. It has to be policy, but we can do our bit.
Yeah, but let me come back to the earlier conversation about allocation, and I want to drill into two aspects of it. One is the very small allocation to infrastructure, and the other is the allocation to the developing world. And so if we can take those two, on infrastructure, essentially climate action, what does it consist of? It consists of pulling forwards by 2, 3, 4 decades investment in zero carbon infrastructure, in new infrastructure, whether it's wind farms, solar, nuclear, energy efficiency, public transport, seawall protection. It's a huge amount of infrastructure that we need to invest in early. And it's kind of like, I suppose the question on the allocation is that's what the world needs to do. And you're sitting on this huge pile of money, right? 1.5% of everything. And you've got this tiny allocation to infrastructure. Isn't that kind of at the heart of the problem of the response to climate change?
Yeah, you're right. We have 2% actually allocated to unlisted renewable energy infrastructure, although we haven't used all that. But I think when you look at that, what you don't take into account is all the investment that's going to take place in the companies that we already invested in, and even in some of the oil and gas companies that have set out larger investments in renewable infrastructure than even for the pure renewable infrastructure companies. So we will still be investing much more in, let's say, opportunities and renewable infrastructure than our allocation. But going back to allocation decision, those are not made by the fund, but made by the parliament. But still, 2% of a large fund, it's a lot of money.
It is, of course, it's a large amount, but the point is surely that it's just not enough. So I agree, it's more than 2%, because there's the 2%, and then there's part of your bond portfolio, part of your equity portfolio as well. But let me come to the other one, which in a way is more structural, and certainly, I mean, these are definitely within the remit of the Ministry of Finance and the mandate that it gives to you. What is your allocation to the developing world? How much does that end up being?
Yes, there is no specific allocation to the developing world. So as you said earlier, it's the FTSE Global All Cap that sort of is the basis for tracking. So no specific allocation to developed market, although we can also invest outside of the index. So we do have investments in some emerging markets.
But it's going to be tiny. It's of the order of 1%. It's something, I mean, just because that's where capital markets are in the developed world. They're not in Malaysia, Indonesia, South Africa. I mean, they have capital markets, but they're tiny compared to the New York, London, Tokyo, and of course China, which I kind of class with the developed world in many ways. So the allocation to, for instance, Africa, I suspect, is almost nothing.
So that's correct. So I think you have to think about, again, the purpose of the fund is really to create wealth for future generation. It's not a climate policy tool, but within that, we work with climate within the allocation set out for where we invest.
I understand that, but here's the thing. So we had a conversation on cleaning up. I spoke to Fatih Birol, and actually, I've spoken to him twice on cleaning up and many times outside that. But the point that he made was that the question of whether we deal with climate change is all about how much money is invested in the fast developing countries of the world. It's not what we do in Europe. It's not what we do even in the US. Even China is now at pretty close to peak emissions, will peak before 2030. It's really about Southeast Asia. It's about India, Malaysia, Indonesia, these huge countries, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Thailand, and all of Africa, which is going to be 1 billion people. And so if your success depends on dealing with climate change, number one. Number two, dealing with climate change involves trillions of dollars being invested in Asia, fast-growing countries, and Africa, and you are investing almost nothing in those geographies. Isn't that just a huge structural problem?
Just to say, we are investing quite a bit in India. Actually, that's it's quite a big market for us. But you go to this sort of structure of the fund, which really it's hard for me to have a strong comment on, because really we work within the mandate given by the ministry and work as well as we can with first of all to generate as much we can of returns, and also we do it in a responsible manner, not the least taking into account climate. I think it will impact our long-term returns, but we don't make the allocation decisions.
No, but could you not go in your annual sort of report, the annual presentation by your CEO to the Ministry of Finance, the kind of this mechanism that exists, and say, look, if you want this fund to be worth the same or more in 2050, climate change has to be addressed. Let's be absolutely clear. We can optimize within the parameters you've given us, but if we just do that, we will end up in a 2.5, possibly a 3-degree world, and this fund will be worth dramatically less. It doesn't matter, how clever we are. We cannot maintain and generate value in that world. Isn't that something that you should be saying to the ministry?
Yeah, you're right. We can give advice on allocation decision. We can give advice. It's then up to the ministry and the parliament to decide on the final sort of main allocation decisions. It is important to remember that the sort of main purpose of the fund is to fund the Norwegian welfare state for many, many generations to come.
And I think, look, what I'm giving you a hard time. I promised I would, and I'm giving you a hard time partly to demonstrate actually how complicated it is, because I go back to the 1 in every 5 teachers, 1 in every 5 doctors, 1 in every 5 nurses funded by this. And it's very difficult to take a big chunk of money and go and do something that may jeopardize the ability to do that in the near term. But there is this conflict between the sort of near term, immediate, close to home, and still the global requirement to deal with climate change. I mean, I think it's just a fascinating kind of case study, perhaps for the audience, why this stuff is difficult, why people who would like to deal with climate change sometimes can't.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, Michael. In a way, you give me a hard time, but it's something that's totally outside my scope to do anything about. But it's truly right. I mean, if you look at climate change and how to address it, it's not going to be solved by investors like us. In the end, to be solved by much larger group like that and politicians in the end. And you say, of course, in a way, allocating a huge amount of money to the developed world will help, but that's not the purpose of the fund.
Right. And, let me say this. Let me just conclude by saying this. If your finance minister or even your prime minister wanted to come on cleaning up and say, okay, now I'm going to give you the big picture. I'm going to click it up one level and talk about Norway's strategy more broadly with respect to climate change, I would, of course, be more than delighted to extend an invitation to them to do so, because it's been a fascinating conversation, and you're quite right. We've reached the point where these are the limitations within which you operate.
Yeah, if I see the Minister of Finance, I'll pass that on, Michael. Maybe you'd like to come and take this discussion further.
Very good, and I very much look forward, whether we do another Engadin ski marathon or whether we just go for a ski. I would very much like for that to happen at some point in the not too distant future.
Likewise, Michael. It's been very nice to connect with you again, and I really hope we can continue the discussion on either skating or skiing or skidding one day.
Absolutely. And if there's anything I can do to help, having given you a hard time, if I can help to solve or to provide insight into something, I know you've got a new climate board that's being assembled and all sorts of things. There's all sorts of ways that we could potentially I could try and help rather than just being difficult. It's been great having you on here today.
It's been great. It was very nice to talk to you, Michael.
Right. Thanks very much, Carine. Bye-bye. So that was Carine Smith, Chief Governance and Compliance Officer at Norges Bank Investment Group, who operate the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. You'll find links in the show notes to the recent episode we mentioned with Fatih Birol, episode 133, as well as a link to Jens Stoltenberg's Harvard Kennedy School lecture, Avoiding the Oil Curse, in which he brilliantly explains the thinking behind the creation of the fund. And, of course, we'll include links to Norges Bank Investment Group's mandate, annual report, and climate strategy.
If you've enjoyed today's conversation, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to Cleaning Up, or leave us a review on your chosen podcast platform. And if you want more from Cleaning Up, sign up for our free newsletter at cleaningup.live, where you'll find our archive of over 150 hours of conversation with extraordinary climate leaders. And why not help someone else learn more about the net zero transition by introducing them to Cleaning Up? Cleaning Up is brought to you by our lead supporter, Capricorn Investment Group, the Liebreich Foundation, and the Gilardini Foundation.